Welcome everyone to another edition of Wetland Wednesdays. This is our sixth one in our fifth ID session. I'd just like to say that I am tuning in today from Saskatoon. We're located on Treaty 6 territory, which encompasses the traditional lands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Stoney First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis. My name's Leanne Latchmoy, and I work for an organization called Birds Canada. We're a nonprofit organization with a mission to drive action to increase understanding, appreciation, and conservation of wild birds. Today, we're going to talk about birds. We're not going to have any frogs or toads. And then we're going to go through collecting a MarshWatch checklist. So I'll introduce you a little bit to the app and just kind of how to get started with collecting a checklist. Afterwards, we're going to talk about some of the guided marsh walks coming up. We've got one this weekend on Saturday and another one the week after in Minnedosa. And then we'll have our quizzes and discussions. Okay. Oh, goodness. This is looking a little strange. Oh, good. So today we're going to talk about diving duck species. We're going to cover the Canvasback, the Redhead, the Lesser Scaup, the Ruddy Duck, as well as the Bufflehead. Now, diving ducks are a little bit different than the ducks that we've covered in this series so far. So diving ducks definitely are, underwater species. They swim underwater to get food. This can be plants, animals, tubers, crustaceans, all manner of things. But the one commonality is that they will dive underwater for food. And birds are really designed for the kind of lifestyle that they lead. So these diving ducks have their feet farther back on their body, and this gives them really good propulsion. So when ducks and other birds are swimming underwater, they don't do so with their wings. They'll keep their wings tucked up and they'll use their feet to paddle around. They've also got small wings for their body size, and this is likely to help them be a little bit more streamlined underwater. But it means that they have a harder time taking off. So if you've ever seen ducks that really need to run across the water, they'll get their wings going, they'll get their feet going, like these canvasbacks in the bottom photo here. They need a little bit of a runway to take off. And they'll also fly with faster, quicker wing beats because those wings are a little bit smaller. They don't have that kind of lift that the dabbling ducks have, the ones that nest over land. Diving ducks also nest either right over the water or pretty close to it because they are kind of awkward on land. So they are designed for that kind of semi-aquatic lifestyle. First up, we have one of my favorite large ducks. This is called the Canvasback. So it's a large diving duck, and it's got a really unique head shape. It's got a very, very sloped forehead and bill. It's pretty distinct in terms of all of the species that we're going to be looking at. So you can imagine this is, a nice bunny hill on the ski run. This is going to be a nice, gentle, easy ski down if you're new to it. The bill is going to be black, and the drakes have this gorgeous kind of rusty red head, and they have a bright white body that's kind of bookended with black on the breast and on the rump. But that white body really, really stands out, especially at a great distance. We're going to compare it to another similar looking red-headed duck in a second here, but that white body is really going to be, your touch point for this species. At a distance, it just glows bright white. I like to think of it, I try to remind myself, it's white like a canvasback. They've also got this kind of shocking little red eye. And we've talked a lot about the speculums in the dabbling species, but in the divers, the wings are generally just a bit more plain. You don't really have that colored speculum patch. There isn't much wing patterning. There can be a little bit of dark and white, but there isn't really, that standout coloration. The hen looks very much the same in terms of body proportion and shape as you might expect. She's got that lovely sloped forehead and bill that's going to be distinct. She also has a nice black bill. She's going to be warm brown overall with a little bit of light flecking throughout. She'll have a bit of a faint eye ring, pale throat, and a black eye, but it's really going to be that kind of large size and that head shape that's going to help distinguish this species from other similar hens. For diet, they're a pretty omnivorous diver, but they tend to eat more plant material than they do insect and snails, but they really do kind of eat anything. So seeds, buds, leaves, rhizomes, tubers, roots, they'll go down and get all of those bits of aquatic plants that are really hard to get at. They'll root right under the water and in the muck. You'll find them in deep water marshes, small lakes, as well as sheltered bays. And for those of you who were out with us in Saskatoon a couple of weeks ago, we had some really great looks at a couple of canvasbacks. The hens are really pretty, I think. They're pretty, subtle. They kind of even brown overall. Again, we've been looking a lot at at dabbling species, and the dabblers are more mottled, right? They've got that patterning that helps them blend in with the grass because they do nest over the water. And so, the hens here are, quite a bit plainer colored. They don't need to look like grass so much because they'll nest right over or right near the water. Now, this is a duck that is more often seen than it is heard, but in case you are curious as to what the sound sounds like, we do have a bit of a ooh sound. A little bit faint. So I like kind of wooing sound, but not something I want you to really focus on. Really focus on the visual ID for the species. And again, it's going to be that white that really stands out at a distance. This is a fairly Western species. There is some pockets in kind of, around the Great Lakes area, but by and large, kind of central and western, northwestern North America. Here's that similar species. And I remember when I first started, coming out to the prairies and really needing to know my ducks well, I was having a little bit of a panic about redheads and canvasback going, gosh, how am I going to tell them apart? In the field, it is so much easier because unlike the canvasback, the redhead, that body color is gray and it doesn't shine that bright white that the canvasback does. It's a little bit smaller. It's more of a medium-sized duck. It's got a much steeper forehead. If you're imagining taking skis off of it, if you're new to skiing, you're probably terrified of that pitch. I know I would be. So the drake is going to have this redder colored head. It's going to have that gray back and body that's not going to shine bright white. It's just going to look dull at a distance. It's going to have that similar kind of black rump and black chest. It'll also have a gray-blue bill that's got a dark tip, slightly edged in a little bit of white, and it's got a mostly yellowish looking eye. So a pretty handsome little duck, and there's quite a bit of a dark tip on the bill. The hens are a fair bit more plain. Again, she's going to have that steep forehead. It's not going to be that gentle slope of the canvasback. She's going to be warm brown with a bit of flecking. She's going to have a pale base to the bill. She's also going to have a bit of a pale eye ring and a little bit of white eyeshadow kind of just behind the eye. The bill is going to be darker than in the males with a darker tip. So in some of them, you can see a little bit of that distinction. In different plumages, it shows up a little bit better. But during the breeding season, overall, the bill is mostly just going to look rather dark. And she's going to have a dark eye. It's not quite black. It's kind of like a dark brown color, but at any sort of distance, it's just going to look like a black eye. She'll have a little bit of white in the wing as well, but kind of a pretty plain brown hen. And don't worry, we're going to compare all of the plain brown hens in a second. This is another omnivorous diver, again, eating a lot of plant materials, so seeds, buds, leaves, rhizomes, tubers, and roots, insects and their larvae, as well as snails. I thought this was just the greatest photo of this redhead just mowing down on a bunch of aquatic plants. Just really gets the point home that yes, some ducks are absolutely vegetarians, or primarily vegetarians. The redhead is a bit more of a wetland generalist. They'll hang out in a little bit shallower wetlands than the canvasback will do. They'll surface feed a little bit as well. They're not quite, tied to diving. They'll feed in a variety of ways. And they have a similar kind of wooing call, but it rises in pitch in the middle of the call as opposed to the canvasback. And this is another one that's more often seen than heard. So the sounds today are mostly just for illustration purposes. We're not going to be giving you very much in the way of quizzes on those because really you don't hear them terribly often. Oh, I didn't change the title of this slide. Sorry, I've been in the field for most of last week. So the redhead's got a very much a central distribution, but it's got a wider distribution than the canvasback. It's going to have that distribution on kind of the southern Great Lakes and that St. Lawrence corridor. So you'll see them back east as well. Okay, let's compare those two red-headed ducks. So we've got the canvasback on the left and the redhead on the right. That head shape is really going to be helpful, especially at a distance, and have that nice sloped forehead and bill. You know, you're thinking bunny hill for that guy, and the head shape is definitely steeper on the redhead. You're thinking maybe a blue or a black diamond or something. Definitely not a bunny hill forehead. The color, again, that bright white body is just going to stand out like a beacon at a distance. You can see it, 100 yards off, and it will just be shining bright white. And I'll show you a photo in a couple seconds, because even in dingy sort of poor light conditions, you're really going to see that bright white. The gray body on the redhead is really going to be what sets it apart from those two species, especially at a distance. You might see that darker head, but that solid gray body is going to let you know that you've got a redhead. And here's a photo that, this is something that you are likely to encounter. You're looking at birds at a distance, the lighting is not great, they're far away, but I think it's pretty easy to pick out the two canvasbacks in this. Oh, missing the audio this week. Okay. Give me 1 second and I will make sure that it's optimized for sound sharing. New share. Share sound. I really wish there was some settings that I could set that would just be the same for everyone. Okay, that should do it. And I'll actually go back and let you hear those sounds. So we'll do the redhead, that kind of woo. Thanks for letting me know. Woo. It is a pretty funny sound. It's not one that I've honestly heard that much myself in the field. So again, a lot of these diving species, they're not terribly chatty with the exception of the ruddy duck. So this is more just for illustrative purposes. And we'll get that canvas back. This is still going to be a little bit harder to hear. It's not a terribly loud recording. It's hard to get a good recording of a canvas back. So. Okay, so that's that kind of hoo noise of the canvasback. And again, it's another one that I think I've only heard a couple of times myself in the field. Okay, getting back to those canvasback and redhead. So I think it's pretty obvious, potentially which ones are the canvasback and which ones are the redhead in this photo. Those two canvasback, so we got one, they're both on kind of the right-hand side, one on the upper right and then one in the lower right. Those are two canvasback, and that bright white really does stand out. You can see these other redheads are all kind of gray looking, barely make out that they've got a reddish head in this photo, but that really steep forehead and that whole look to them, we've got redheads. Okay, here's another one for today. We've got the lesser Scaup. This is a medium-sized diving duck. And it kind of looks like an Oreo cookie, especially at a distance. So that kind of rump and that head and breast are going to be black. The middle of the body is going to be paler. Its back is this really nice vermiculated, black and white barring that close up looks really kind of trippy. It's very jagged line looking, but at a distance, it just kind of fades to a gray. And they've got white flanks below that. So it's not a solid gray body. It's kind of got gray on top and white on bottom, but bookended by very, very jet black, head, breast, and rump. So I like to think of it as kind of like an Oreo cookie. They do have a nice bright yellow eye, and you're going to need to compare this if you're interested in birding kind of during the migration season to greater Scaup. They're a little bit tricky to tell these two apart, so it is okay, especially as a new birder, to just say they are Scaup while you're looking at birds on migration, because it is kind of tough to tell these two apart. The lesser Scaup has kind of this bluish purple iridescence to the head. The greater is going to have a bit more of a greenish one, but it can also look purpley blue. Iridescence is very, dependent on light conditions and angle between you and the bird and the light source. So just know that, the iridescent color on the head is not necessarily the best field mark between the two, but generally speaking, lesser Scaup has this kind of shiny blue purple look to it. And that little, yellowish eye. The wing is kind of, that speculum patch would be white bordered with black. That's one of the more kind of standout ones in the diving species. So that's our drake, a little bit of an Oreo cookie look to it. It's also got a really cute little blue bill with a black nail on the end. That portion of that bill there is called the nail. The hens, however, are a little bit variable. They're quite a darker brown than the other hens that we've looked at. And they've got this kind of yellow to brownish colored eye. And I saw this described, between rabbits and hares. And to me, the lesser Scaup looks like it's been weighted down with the burden of prophecy. It just looks like it's a little bit mad. It's a little bit crazed. It's that yellowish eye to it. So it's got this gray chocolate brown color with a little bit of light flecking. The upper parts tend to be a little bit darker, so the back portion. And the white at the base of the bill is quite variable between individuals, and especially during the time of year. So during the breeding season, the white is going to be fairly reduced. So in the two hens on the upper photo, there's not very much white. You can see that there's a little bit of paleness at the base of the bill, but there isn't a ton of white. The two bottom photos show hens with a little bit more, white to them. And in the non-breeding season, they'll develop quite the white patch around their bill, but they do look quite plain and quite drab during the breeding season. Again, they're not trying to attract a lot of attention to them. So that is our lesser Scaup hen. For diet, these guys are invertebrate seekers, so they're going to be going after insects, larvae, crustaceans, mollusks, and they'll eat a little bit of aquatic plants and seeds. You'll find them in all kinds of wetlands, lakes, rivers with emergent vegetation, all over the place. And they're generally silent, but here is their call. So again, generally silent, so focus on the visual. Lesser Scaup are definitely a central and western species. You can see them really, across the Great Plains, the pothole wetlands, and into the boreal forest. Okay, let's take a look at those large brown diving hens. So we've got the Canvasback, the Redhead, and the lesser Scaup. So that sloped forehead in the Canvasback is pretty distinct between all of these species. Really quite a large head and quite a slope, a nice, easy, gentle bunny hill skiing. The forehead is going to be steeper in both the Redhead and the lesser Scaup. They're all going to be kind of this brown color, but the lesser Scaup is going to be a darker brown overall. It's just going to be a little bit darker on the upper parts. The Canvasback has that pale eye ring and a pale throat. The Redhead is going to have that pale eye ring, some pale eyeshadow, and a pale base of the bill. And is going to be kind of variable where the white is on the lesser Scaup hen. A little bit of white at the base of the bill, less so in the breeding season. She's going to be the only one that's going to have that yellow or brownish eye when we're comparing these three species. The other ones, they're all going to look like they have a black eye, especially at a distance. And they're all going to have a relatively dark bill. So thinking, back to some of those dabbling species, there aren't, a lot of them have lighter colored bills compared to some of these diving hens. So that's the comparison of those three species. And again, if you're just getting started with ducks, focus on the boys first, and then, learn the females, learn the hens by association. Okay, here is a truly marsh duck species. This is a small compact diving duck called the Ruddy Duck. It's aptly named. It is kind of this blob of this rusty reddish color. It belongs to a group of ducks called the stiff-tailed ducks, and they often have their tail raised. The drakes more so than the hens, but they'll both do it, and the drakes will often just be floating out at a distance on the water with those tails up. I saw a whole bunch of them this weekend, and that was mostly how we identified them, at a quick glance. You're scanning, and all you see is this compact little duck with this tail sticking straight up. There's nothing else. That's going to be your ruddy duck. So even in terrible lighting conditions at a distance, that shape is going to be pretty unique. The males are going to be rusty overall. They'll have a cute little black cap, a bright white cheek patch, and just the bluest bill you have ever seen. If you have never seen a ruddy duck, I suggest you try to get out to kind of a shallow, marshy wetland and see if you can't spy any. I know there was some on our trip in Saskatoon, so you might have some luck there if you're in the area. The sexes are similar when it comes to the wings. The wings are mostly just dark and fairly nondescript, also quite tiny. The hens are also nice and distinct. They have that compact shape. They do have a stiff tail. They don't often sit with it, cocked straight up. They'll, keep it out a little bit, sometimes lay it completely flat in the water, but sometimes they'll have it up. They have a dark cap as well, and they have a pale cheek patch with a dark stripe below the eye. Another dark-billed hen, and again, that kind of darkish wing. So dark brown overall, pretty compact looking, still has a relatively large bill for its body size. And again, pale cheek with that stripe running from the bill kind of straight back to the back of the head. Kind of a unique look. These are another invertebrate seeker, so they'll be eating insects, larvae, crustaceans, zooplanktons, and small amounts of aquatic plant parts and seeds. What's really fun to watch is they'll do this really cute little bubbling display, and they'll stick their tail straight up, they'll arch their neck, and they'll actually get little head feathers sticking out, little horns, and they will start smacking their bill against their breast, making bubbles in the water as they kind of whack the air out of their feathers, and they'll do this with increasing frequency, and they'll let out a little sound. I'll play the sound for you because it's just an adorable little noise. So this is one that I have heard a fair bit. It's really, really funny to watch them do this little bubbling display. And it's cute. Their little chicks also kind of resemble the females with that dark stripe below the eye and that pale cheek patch. And just to give you an idea for how far back diving species have their legs placed on their body, just check out how far back this ruddy duck little guy has his leg. It's pretty amazing. It's not, kind of centrally located on his body like most of the dabbling species. This is a duck that really, in terms of populations, really depends heavily on the prairie pothole wetlands. 86% of the population breeds in the prairie potholes, and we do lose prairie pothole wetlands, so they're an incredibly important habitat, not just for ruddy ducks, but for ruddy ducks, they are a very important habitat. This is a species with a distribution kind of in, central North America, that kind of Great Plains up into the boreal forest, as well as the Great Lakes region. But you'll also find them in Europe and parts of North Africa as well, which is pretty interesting. We'll zoom in here on the North American context, and you can see really, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, into the boreal forest there, and then that kind of Great Lakes region is where we have them up here in Canada. And last but not least, the introductory slide species is the Bufflehead. This is a small little diving duck. It's got a short, stubby little bill. So if you compare it to pretty much any of the other duck species, this is going to be like just a very tiny little bill. And the drake is really quite iconic. He's got a black back and a black head, and this large white patch on the back of the head. Again, this is something that just stands out from a mile away. You've got this kind of, black back with a white underparts and this, white patch on this dark head. There is no mistaking the Bufflehead. They can definitely be seen at quite a distance. And the iridescence on these guys is just really incredible. You get them in the right light and they really shine rainbow colors. So you can see in this bird on the left, the bottom left here, at a distance, you can't really see any of that iridescence, but you can really see that white patch on the back of the head and that, black upper parts and white underparts. But really, if you focus on anything, the Bufflehead, that makes you think there's something going on with the head there. So, that head patch is going to be, the best ID clue that you've got for the drakes here. They've got black and white wings, a little bit of a white wing patch in there. The hens are also kind of unique. That's another small little bird, short, stubby little bill. So just that size and that shape is going to help, point you to a small diving species. They are going to be diving a fair bit. They're quite active little feeders. She's going to have this white patch below the eye. It's kind of like a horizontal oval. Otherwise, kind of this gray-brown body, darker, darker gray in the head and upper parts and lighter gray on the lower body. Her little white wing patch often shows a fair bit while she's floating around on the water, but that horizontal oval kind of below and behind the eye is going to be a really good clue. You'll often see them with the drakes, especially in the spring season, just actively diving. They'll hang out in groups usually. So that is the Bufflehead hen. These guys are another invertebrate seeker, so they'll dive underwater and be chasing after insects, their larvae, crustaceans, mollusks, and some seeds. In terms of habitat, you're going to be finding them more on ponds and small lakes near trees. And this is because they're a cavity nesting species and they rely on cavities excavated by the northern flicker. So their ranges match up really nicely because they really do rely on those specific cavities excavated by the northern flickers. It is just the right size. And you wouldn't think that, a northern flicker, which I'm sure lots of folks are familiar with, it's a woodpecker that actually eats a lot of ants, so you'll see it on the ground a fair bit, that a duck could fit into a nest excavated by one of those. But I've had the opportunity to do some duck banding, and ducks are mostly, just curved feathers. If you're ever banding them, you actually have to hold on a little bit because, the feathers are so squishy. So they can get into rather tight spaces that you wouldn't immediately think a duck could fit into. But these are a cavity nesting species, so there's going to be either trees around their nesting pond or in the, kind of close vicinity. They are divers. They can do, a little bit of walking on land. They're not quite as awkward as some species, but, and they will have to trudge along and get their little kids out onto a pond kind of as soon as they fledge. Oh, and that is our Bufflehead. And this is kind of an interesting range map. It shows some of the breeding range is scarce, but I'm not sure quite how scarce it is in all of those areas. So definitely a boreal species in the east, and you'll find them in the parkland as well as the boreal forest, centrally located on the plains. And that is our Bufflehead range. So let's compare those small, dark diving hens. We've got the Ruddy Duck and the Bufflehead. The Ruddy Duck is going to have a pale cheek patch with that stripe along the cheek, right below the eye. It's going to have a relatively large bill size, for the rest of its body. It's going to be warmer brown overall. The Bufflehead is going to have that white oval below the eye. It's going to have a really small, stubby little bill, and it's going to be kind of a dark gray. It's definitely a cooler toned color than, say, the Ruddy Duck hen. So those are our two small, dark diving hens. The Ruddy Duck can have its tail up a little bit, the hen, but oftentimes she'll have it down. She won't always be sticking it straight up in the air. Okay, and those are our little diving hens. So our birds today were the Canvasback Redhead, Lesser Scaup, Ruddy Duck, and the Bufflehead. And those are going to be covering the diving species for this webinar series. And next up, perhaps you might want to collect a checklist for MarshWatch. I feel like we're at a point where I think a lot of folks have, gotten enough skills, or we've covered enough species that you might feel confident in heading out and collecting a checklist of sorts. So the first thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to register on NatureCounts. This is Birds Canada's data repository. You'll need to either get the smartphone app or print off a datasheet. I've actually made the datasheet with a bunch of helpful hints and stuff on the back side of it. So even if you're using the app, you might want to check out the datasheet and print that off just as a helpful reminder for some of the tips. I go over some of the sounds of the cryptic marsh birds species, so the ones that you're more likely to hear than to see pretty much ever. As well as the key features for the drakes and the amphibian calling codes, which we'll go over in a little bit here. And next, once you've got the app or your data sheet and you're ready to go, the next thing to do is to observe birds. So go out to any wetland you like and identify birds, count them, and note the amphibians. And once you're done, submit your observations. If you're using the app, you can just hit submit and your job is done. If you're old school like me and like to do it on paper, you need to go onto the website later on and enter in your observations. So I'll walk you through some of those steps. To register, the easiest way to do it is to visit the MarshWatch main website. And at the end of this, I will post the link for that main site in the chat, but I think most of you have it by now. On the right hand side, there's a couple of menu options, and one of them is submit observations on NatureCounts. So you can click on that and you'll have to register. Even if you're getting the app, you'll need to register on the website beforehand. Next is getting your NatureCounts login. If you have never done anything with Birds Canada before, you have no account, you've never participated in Feeder Watch or a Breeding Bird Atlas or anything like that, and you don't have an account, you can sign up for one. It's free. There's fields to give location and where you're from. All of that is optional. First name, last name, and password are really most of what we need. So you can sign up if you have no account. If you already have an existing account, say you were an Atlas participant, or you've participated in some other programming that we do, like the Nocturnal Owl Survey, right below the sign up, there's a portion that says, if you have a NatureCounts login and wish to register for the project, click here. This will allow you to register for the MarshWatch program. So if you have an existing account, click there and it'll prompt you to enter your login and password. Next, get the app or the datasheet. So you can download the NatureCounts app. It's available on iPhone and Android, so get it from the Apple Store or Google Play. And you can download that onto your smartphone. I also suggest that you download and print off at least one copy of the data sheet. That's going to be on the MarshWatch main site, and I'll have it under resources. It should be up by the end of the day tomorrow is what I'm aiming for. I have it already. I need to get our website editor to make some edits to the website and upload it. So it will be under resources. And then next, go out and observe some birds. So this can be any wetland that you choose, any type of wetland. You can go to multiple wetlands. You don't have to participate. This is just, usually I think it drives it home a little bit more if you have yourself a mini option. And don't worry if you feel like you have gone through these webinars and you still only know a handful of species. There's ways to submit the information that we know you're not submitting a complete checklist. Any information is useful so long as you're sure about what you're identifying. So get out, look and listen for birds, identify what you can, and count or estimate the number of individuals. And this gives us an idea of, how many-ish birds are in an area. So, if you're at a crazy wetland and there's a ton of red-winged blackbirds, make an estimate. I don't think you need to, it's hard to count every single one, but what you can do is just say, oh, I'm counting the ones that are close, and there's definitely twice as many of that, farther off in the wetland. Give yourself an estimate, and that's good practice, just letting us know roughly-ish how many there are. You can listen for amphibians. This is usually best done early in the day, especially early in the breeding season, but you can still hear a few. And identify what you can and estimate the abundance with the call code. I'll go over the call codes in a little bit here, but we can talk about that. Remember to note down the whens and the wheres. So what's great about the app is that it prompts you to do all of that kind of immediately, and it already is recording the start time, the duration, and the date for you, and it prompts you for the location. If you're doing this on the paper data form, there's going to be fields for you to fill out, and the best rule for data sheet filling out is to try to leave as few blanks as possible, especially in that location information. So definitely fill out all of those. And it's also going to ask you if this was a complete checklist. So you can think of a complete checklist as you're confident, you are reporting all of the species that you were encountering and able to identify. Just remember, sometimes a small tiny bird zips past and you can't get a good look at it and it's gone. I can't identify that. And that's normal. You're not going to be able to identify every single bird that crosses your path, but within reason. If you have really good looks at it and you're just like, oh God, I don't know. It's okay to not report those. You would just report your checklist as an incomplete one. So if you don't feel confident about all of your observations, or you left out, is like, there was a lot of stuff that I didn't know, then mark that as an incomplete checklist. And you can think of that as, you're missing pieces of the pie. You're like, you got some of the pie, but you weren't reporting the whole pie. So report it as an incomplete checklist. And it's important, on our end, when we're using that information, to know if you're reporting everything or if you're not reporting everything. So don't feel bad if you just report incomplete checklists. That's fine. That is totally okay. And that information is still useful. If you're able to do a complete checklist, you're like, yeah, I'm a pretty good observer and I know most of what I'm seeing and hearing in this habitat, then go ahead and submit a complete checklist. And last but not least, submit your observations. If you're doing it through the smartphone app, it's pretty easy to do. You just, hit submit and it's all done. It uploads it to the database. If you are in an area that doesn't have cell coverage, it will save a draft of that checklist, and then you can go in later into your drafts and submit the checklist when you get home and have some internet service. Or if you're doing it on paper form, you can submit it later on the website, and you can visit the MarshWatch main site and click on that submit observations. It will take you to the NatureCounts page, and there's an easy button to click to submit your observations. Just quickly, the NatureCounts app is pretty straightforward. I'm going to make a short little video and post that to the website and on the YouTube channel, just so that you can have a bit more of a video of going through the app itself. I didn't want to take up all of our time today doing that, but it's a pretty straightforward app. It's going to auto record the date and the start time. If you were there a couple of minutes earlier, that's fine. Just make edits to the time. You can edit your location if you're not happy with where it was, or even if you want to use this to submit a checklist that you had taken earlier, you can go ahead and do that. Once you enter in the date, time, and location information, you hit next, and then you've got that species list for the birds that we're covering in the MarshWatch program. And it's a simple tap to tap the count or the call code for the amphibians. The amphibians aren't automatically populating on this list because it runs off of the eBird location information, and eBird doesn't take track of amphibian species, so you'll need to search for the amphibian names in that upper bar in the search species, but that's kind of the only quirk that we have. Otherwise, you can keep tapping those birds. If you make a mistake and you want to change that, you can press and hold, and you can delete or you can clear the information for that species. So I'll make a video going through this, but once you're done with your checklist, you can hit review, go through, make sure all of the timing is correct. If you have any comments, you can enter in the number of observers, and then it will ask you if this was a complete checklist or not. And again, don't feel bad if you're going to be doing incomplete checklists. That is totally fine. We would rather have more incomplete checklists than ones that are complete and not really complete, if that makes sense. And again, all of the information is valuable. It all feeds into a large national database. And this is the kind of thing that helps researchers and scientists get ideas for where birds are distributed throughout the continent, really. So I mentioned some of these amphibian call codes, and these are there because it's really tough to count amphibians. If you've ever been out there and you hear a bunch of frogs or toads calling, it's hard. You can't really get a good count of the population size just by listening to them and get like, oh, hey, there's two over here, there's one over here, because they call in a bit of a chorus type thing. So there's a calling code. So calling code 1 is where individuals can be counted. There's enough space between the start of calls, they're not the starts are not overlapping. There can be a little bit of overlap in the calls, but there's not multiple amphibians calling simultaneously of the same species. This is because when frogs are calling, they're doing so because they're trying to attract a mate, and they don't want their call to be buried in amongst all of the other males. So they're all kind of trying to avoid each other to to the extent that it's possible. So a smaller population, they're going to be avoiding each other pretty well. As the population gets larger and larger, it gets harder to avoid each other's calls, and so there's more and more overlap. So I've got an example. All of these examples are going to be boreal chorus frogs, and so here's an example of call code 1 where there's a little bit of overlap, but it's going to be easy enough. If you're out there standing, it's going to be easy enough to count the individuals. You'll have some of that spatial information that's a little bit lost in the recording, but you'll be able to hear and get a sense for, roughly how many. And if you had to, you probably could count the individuals of this. So let's take a listen to this segment here. So I'll just play that again. So there's a little bit of overlap, mostly no overlap, and you can hear it, all around you, and you can count the different frogs. In the next one, there's some overlap of calls, like there's some simultaneous calling, but there's breaks in the chorus. It's not full on, frogs calling nonstop. There's some breaks. There is a little bit of overlapping, and it's getting harder to count individuals, but you can roughly, estimate the number of individuals. I think this is probably 8 frogs or 10 frogs. You can reasonably estimate that, but it's getting louder. There are more frog calling. And if you're listening with really good headphones, there's a few instances where there's, a couple of individuals calling pretty much simultaneously. So this is definitely call code 2. It can get a little bit busier than that. But last but not least, we've got call code 3, and this is a full chorus. The calls are constant, they're continuous, and they're overlapping, and you're kind of just hit with this wall of frog sound. And I've had this before. You get to somewhere, and if you get close to it, like they often quiet down, but if you stay there a little bit, they'll start back up again, and it can just be, amazingly busy. And this is, there's no way you could reasonably estimate the number of frogs in this chorus. So here's an example of call code 3. Oh, it's not quite as loud as I had hoped. Anyway, it's just really loud calls that don't stop. They just keep going and going and going. And those are our amphibian call codes. So thank you so much for tuning in. My contact information is up on the slide here. You can visit Birds Canada on all of the socials. I'd like to say a big thank you to the Manitoba Fish and Wildlife Enhancement Fund, as well as the Government of Canada, for supporting this work.